Should you buy an E36 BMW in 2024? This is my 1996 BMW E36 323i. And today we're going to be talking about 5 pros and 5 cons of one of the greatest chassis to ever come out of Munich. I've owned it for about a year, so I'm pretty qualified to tell you what's good and what's not. So stick around and we'll figure out whether you should go and spend your hard-earned on it. So the best thing about E36s is their cost, and that's where I'm going to start with for pro number 1. In Australia, you can pick up a 6-cylinder E36 still at this point in time in 2024 under $10,000 if you're lucky. I have seen a few of them start to get listed above $10,000, sort of between $10,000 to $15,000. I'm not really confident on those ones that are selling. I have seen one go for about $18,000, and that was a mint Boston Green example, which was very, very rare. But something like this, a Hellrot sedan 323i, so you get the 6-cylinder, you can easily pick those up for under $10,000. If it's a first car and you're looking to buy something, you're on a limited budget and you just want to get something really cool, then this is a really good option if it's been looked after. But that is something that you have to check, is whether it has been looked after or not, because a lot of them haven't, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I do like how accessible these cars are. There's heaps of them around the place. You'll find them absolutely anywhere. It doesn't matter what state you're in. If you're watching this from overseas, you'll be able to find them all over the world. Obviously, they were BMW's flagship sedan in the 90s after replacing the E30 when the E36s came along, so it's not like they're a rare car. It's very, very easy to get into, to learn how to drive them, particularly if you get a manual one, and if it is your first car. They're very forgiving gearboxes, very, very easy cars to drive, and the M52, which I've got in here, is a very, very strong motor. So the second pro of this car is perhaps its most famous one, and that is the engine. So this car is an E36 323i, which was powered by an M52 B25, which from factory had around 125 kilowatts, or if you're watching this in America, 170 horsepower. And it probably has lost a few over the years, but these 6 cylinders have gone down in history as some of the best motors that BMW have ever made. They are faultlessly reliable if looked after, besides the cooling systems, which we'll talk about very soon. But if you look after these motors, there's a reason why they're so popular, and it is a very, very good choice if you're looking at buying one. You can buy these in the 4-cylinder variant. They're not as gutsy, even though these aren't very gutsy by modern standards. The reason I'm focusing on this Pro is because this is the 6-cylinder. You can get the M52 or the M50 in the 323i, the 325i, or the 328i, and of course you also get the 6-cylinder in the M3. But this engine is an engine that lots of people decide to swap into other chassis, such as E30s. A big dream for me is to have an E30 with this very motor in it. In a lightweight chassis with a few mods, these motors do go very hard. So you can buy these cars in the 4-cylinder as well. But for the reasons of this video, we're not focusing on the 4-cylinder. I have owned a 4-cylinder E36. You can see it on the screen now. It was my 318 IS, which was a bit of a letdown. The car felt like it had asthma, felt like it was running on maybe 3 cylinders, they're horrendously underpowered, very, very, very slow. If you drive one of these and you think this is slow, I would definitely recommend not going anywhere near the 4-cylinder. But for now, we're focusing on this particular motor, the 6-cylinder M52 B25. Absolutely awesome motor. If you look after it, these are pretty bulletproof. This one's got nearly 270,000 kilometers on it, and it just goes and goes and goes. And they were designed to be run into the ground from factory by BMW, so they are very good motors. The third pro and positive thing about E36 ownership is that when things do go wrong, which does happen relatively often, as I'll talk about later on, the parts are quite easy to find. Recently, my radiator decided to exit the chat, which is something very, very common in E36 ownership. It's a bit of a rite of passage. I think if you have one of these cars for any extended period of time and the radiator doesn't go, you are a very, very lucky person. I experienced that, and I found parts locally available almost instantly, and they arrived within a couple of days, and I changed pretty much everything in the cooling system at the front end of the car. I did the radiator, the hoses, the thermostat housing, the thermostat, and a bunch of other little bits and bobs around the place just to tidy it all up. I changed pretty much everything except the water pump. And since then, the car's been running like a dream. extreme, the temperature's been great, so when something does go wrong, you can at least have the peace of mind of knowing that the parts are actually accessible and easy to find, because something will go wrong and it just depends how severe it is when it does. But as I said, if it does go wrong, at least you know that the parts are accessible. So even with parts, BMW, if you prefer buying from the dealer, do stock a large range of parts for these cars. They know that people love to drive these cars still. They know that people daily drive these cars just like I do, and there's a lot of enthusiasts that own these cars and want to use OEM parts. So BMW stock a large range of parts for these, but you can also find reproduction parts all over the internet, which is really, really handy. Pro number 4 about E36 ownership is that they are a fantastic base for modification. People all over the world have done all sorts of things to these cars since the 90s, and people are still doing some pretty crazy things to E36s. They are just such a good chassis to put a new engine in. If you want to increase the horsepower of the engine, a lot of people turbo the M52. You know, you can put all sorts of different body kits on them. You can do factory mods just like AC Schnitzer parts. There are people all over the place who are running AC Schnitzer wheels and front bumpers and body kits if you want to go that more OEM plus style, or you can go the complete opposite end of the spectrum and drop a JZ engine in it. You can put a 1J or a 2J in these because the engine bay has plenty of room to be able to do that. You can put whatever sort of wheels you want on it, and it's just like a fantastic car for you to really show off your individual modification preferences. And it's just a fantastic base, even just to enjoy stock, but the further you go with it, the sort of options are limitless, which is really great. And there's a lot of aftermarket support for these because people know how much these cars are loved around the world. So if you're looking to buy one to modify it, or if you're looking to buy one to keep it stock, you can do that. And that's one of the best things about these cars. So rounding out our list of pros at number 5, and I've saved the best for last here, and that is the styling. So these cars take the principle of simple yet effective. I absolutely love boxy shapes. You can see on my shirt, the E30 is one of my favorite cars. These took a lot of inspiration by just modernizing, but keeping it simple in terms of that boxy, super saloon style shape. You can do a whole lot to them, which goes back to my other pro of being such a great base for modifications. If you want to chuck an M3 kit on, you can do that. If you want to put some lip kits on, you can do that. If you want to run some 3-piece AC Schnitzer wheels, you can also do that. Because the body is so simple, the opportunities for modifications on these cars is endless, but I really love them in stock form. This car I haven't touched at all since putting the Style 66 wheels on it, and I still think it looks pretty cool. The front end could probably do with a little bit of a facelift with the M3 bar that I've had sitting in bubble wrap for months, but besides that, I think these cars look fantastic. So with the good, obviously has to come a little bit of the bad, and that's where we start our list of cons for the BMW E36. This car here is a 1996, which makes it 28 years old. This car is actually eligible for historic registration, and if that doesn't tell you that the car's old, then I don't know what else does. And being such an old car, that means it comes with its fair share of issues. Like any old cars, parts start to perish, you have your wear and tear items go, and also big ticket things can happen to the car. In my experience with this car, thankfully, there's been a lot of preventative maintenance done to it before I purchased it to make sure that a lot of big ticket items didn't go wrong, which is a big tip for you that if you're buying one, make sure it's got service history. Make sure that someone has actually looked after it, because if they haven't, you're going to be in for one hell of a time. These cars are getting pretty old now, which leads me to my second con, and that is how hard it is to actually find a clean example. You don't have to look very far in Facebook Marketplace, regardless of where you are watching this from in the world, to find so many thrashed, cracked out examples of E36s. They're all over the internet. It doesn't really take that long to find one. Luckily for me, I bought this from an enthusiast. I bought this off my mate Matt, who runs the best pizza shop in Adelaide. And he spent a lot of time making sure this car was in the absolute best condition it could be. I'm not just saying this because it's my car, but this is one of the cleanest E36s that I've ever seen. If you're looking to buy one of these, like any modern classic car now, make sure it's had all the preventative maintenance done. Make sure that it's got as many receipts and the owner's books, and make sure it has all the documentation and they're actually buying it from a trusted seller. Don't go to some guy's house to realize that he's only selling this to fund his drug addiction, because he probably hasn't looked after the car. And trust me, plenty of crackies own E36s. So the third con with this car is perhaps one of the most obvious ones, and maybe I should have started with this, but this car, by not even modern standards, just by any standards, is quite slow. I do love the E36 platform, I really enjoy it, but even if you're in an M3 with the highest output motor that these came with, they are still quite a slow car. Now I know a lot of people probably in the comments are saying, yes, they are, but sometimes it's more fun to drive a slow car fast, and I do agree with that in some ways, but in my experience, and this is obviously a very subjective video about my ownership, having owned this car for coming up on a year very soon, it is very slow, and that does make it often very uninspiring to drive. And I think because it's so uninspiring to drive, I've been very fortunate enough to have some very powerful cars in my GTR and my Evo and my RX-7. When you get used to having a turbo car and you come back to something that's NA and that doesn't have a high output NA motor, it is very, very hard. It feels like there's something lacking and that you're missing something. And this car, you know, because it is very lightweight, does make up for that a little bit. So if you're up in the hills, or if you're in America watching this, the canyons, or in any form of sort of mountain driving, if you keep the rev range really high, the car does feel a lot quicker than it does usually. But you know, if you're wanting to overtake around a little bit of traffic or put your foot down a little bit, the car is very, very sluggish until about 5,000 RPM, which you don't really do much, obviously, driving around on the streets. So to get the most out of these cars, you do have to rev the absolute crap out of them. But at the end of the day, some people prefer slower cars and some people prefer to drive slower cars fast. But for me, it is a bit of a con that this car doesn't really suck you back into your seat, and it doesn't really inspire any form of driving or emotion when you're driving, because it doesn't have that feeling of, oh my God, I'm gonna die, like some of the other cars that I've owned, which are very exciting. But as I said, that's just my personal preference. Everyone's different. It's not to say the car's a bad car, it's just not a very fast car. As I touched on before, these cars are very old and they can be very costly to repair, which leads me into con number 4, is repair costs, and on that point, frequency of repairs. This E36 is a 1996 model. It's older than me, and it has had a very good life of being looked after. A lot of them haven't, but even then, even if you look after it as best as you can, you're still, like most cars, gonna have wear and tear items. But this car is an old BMW. Old BMWs are renowned for having things go wrong frequently. You don't have to look very far on the internet, or even if you're not into cars whatsoever, to find people talking about how unreliable old BMWs are. In my experience with this car, I wouldn't say it's been greatly unreliable. I've owned it, as I mentioned, since August last year, and it's now May, and in that time, the only things that have gone wrong is the aircon compressor has died, which is probably the first time that that has happened over the lifespan of this E36, and my radiator went and met God. And that's fine, because they're things that you expect to go wrong. The car's got nearly 270,000 kilometers on it at this point, and it's, you know, it's no spring chicken, but it does the job. However, I do need to mention it, and it probably does go without saying, that these cars can be very costly to repair should something go wrong. It would be remiss of me to mention that BMWs aren't expensive to maintain. By any sort of standard, this car, for me, I've found has been okay. But again, you could get a really poor example and have to spend thousands of dollars on it. So I wouldn't be doing this video justice if I didn't mention that fact. Now, this probably shows how good the E36 as a car really is still in 2024. Is that I actually struggled to find a fifth con that was worth talking about. But considering we are in 2024 now, this car lacks a lot of creature comforts, which we'll talk about for the fifth con. If you're like me and you've had the experience, whether it's being a passenger or driving or owning a newer car that has cruise control and heated seats and Apple CarPlay and all sorts of things like that, it does take a lot of getting used to go back to something as old as this. But in saying that, you don't buy a car like this because you want the creature comforts. You buy it because it's an analog, really direct driving experience that often new cars can't give you. But it is worth mentioning that this car does go without a lot of those creature comforts. It's not the most comfortable thing in the world. This car has Bilstein shocks and some lowered springs and the Style 66 wheels, which are bigger than the stock wheels that are the 16-inch. I've gone to 17-inch. So the ride on this car is pretty rough. You can probably see even in this video that it's a bit jumpy, even trying to hold the camera as still as possible. But if you can get over those small things, then it is quite a fun car to be in. However, for the daily driving to and from work, in and out of the city, it does get a little bit tiring, so it is worth a mention. So, should you buy an E36 in 2024? In my opinion, I think absolutely. As long as you treat these cars like an old car and you don't treat it like a brand new car, then why wouldn't you buy one? They're fun, they're cheap, they look good, they're very easy to modify, they're very easy to work on. So why wouldn't you want one? Whether it's your first car or your 25th car like it is for me. I think there's a place for an E36 in everyone's garage. If you stuck around this far, Thanks very much for watching. Again, my name's Pat. You've been watching 2PJZ. If you like this sort of content, please leave the video a like, hit the comment box about what you would like to see next with this car or another car, and make sure you subscribe to this channel and put post notifications on for every single time I drop a new video. Appreciate it. Oh no, it didn't start.